There's a new hardware revision for the Sony PlayStation 5 available right now. The CFI-1000 class of machine we've had since launch has been superseded with a CFI-1100 series alternative, and with it comes some degree of controversy. You see, while on the outside the new PS5 looks basically identical to the launch machine, the internals have been significantly revised. The new machine is around 300 grams lighter, and as showcased in a recent video by Austin Evans, the weight differential is down to a simplified cooling setup. The size of the heatsink is smaller, while the use of the more thermally conductive copper is pared back significantly. The cost implications are obvious, dropping back on the size and the materials of the cooler makes for a cheaper machine. And Sony has recently said that the disc version of the PlayStation 5 no longer loses money on each machine sold. But does this make for a hotter, worse machine than the launch unit? That's part and parcel of this video, where my thoughts and testing are augmented with internal hardware analysis courtesy of Steve Burke from Gamers Nexus. Yes, it's a collaboration. So, in theory, if everything goes to plan here, the CFI-1100 should be what you might call a nothing burger. Sony hasn't made any kind of attempt to publicize the arrival of a new model, just as it never did with phased hardware revisions of PS4 and PS4 Pro consoles. For the platform holder, it's business as usual, which may explain why the company did not choose to comment when I asked them about the changes in the new machine. So I guess from their perspective, it's a PS5, end of story. But with that said, we've seen both PS4 and PS4 Pro receive these kind of silent updates every now and then. And in pretty much all cases, we saw the machines become quieter from one revision to the next, even if the only real external physical change we ever saw amounted to a revised power input on PlayStation 4 Pro. PS4 Slim, well, this is something different. This is an actual full-blooded product revision based on a new processor on a smaller production process, something quite different from iteratively updated products like this one. So yeah, PS5's CFI-1100 is essentially identical from a physical perspective to the launch model, weight differentials apart. Even the packaging looks pretty much the same, but you can tell whether you're getting the new revision or not by looking at the product codes on the packaging, and indeed on the machine. The disc unit I bought in the UK is a CFI-1116A, as opposed to my launch disc unit, CFI-1016A. The codes are displayed with reasonable prominence on the box, so you know what to look for. The only change you'll notice with the machine is this: you get, and please don't laugh, a new screw for the bundled stand. I mean, it's an almost inconsequential change, but it does at least mean that you don't actually need to have a flathead screwdriver to screw in the stand to the base of the console. You get more purchase on the new screw with your fingers, and it's easier to secure by hand. On the face of it then, actual physical changes on the exterior are kept to the minimum. And to be honest, even internally, crucial core components have not changed. Major console revisions are generally tied to moving the system on chip, the main processor, from one silicon fabrication process to another. But controversies aside, this is not a major console revision. We can see here that the new PS5 draws pretty much the same peak power as the launch model. On screen here, we are looking at power consumption on both the CFI-1000 series PlayStation 5 to the left and a CFI-1100 on the right. In Spider-Man Miles Morales in Performance RT mode, the game aims to deliver 60 frames per second with ray-traced reflections at a dynamic resolution varying between 1080p at the minimum and 1440p at the max. Now, we'll talk about system performance in general and with Miles Morales specifically a bit further on. But ultimately, we're looking at identical workloads producing a very, very similar power draw. Another test we'll come back to in due course performance-wise is Remedy's control. With ray tracing active, the game has a 30 frames per second cap, but moving into photo mode removes the frame rate limit, and the title attempts to push out as many frames as possible with VSync capping at a theoretical 60 frames per second max. Returning to the power draw comparison, again you can see that power exceeds 200 watts on both systems in photo mode, where frame rates are indeed being pushed to the max. So what about the internal changes? Before I hand over to Steve Burke, I think it's important to describe the process of making a launch console. There are perfectly valid reasons to pare back what may be over-engineered consoles or to course correct just a touch because, put simply, launch hardware sees all console components designed in parallel, not one after the other, not in series. The cooler will be engineered without access to final production silicon. With Xbox One here, the cooler was over-engineered to the point where Microsoft increased CPU core clocks by 9.4% and GPU clock by 6.8%, a process that only happened once the Xbox team realized that they had the cooling overhead to do so. In the case of PlayStation 5, a pared-back cooling solution is likely the result of more time with actual production silicon, plus a ton of telemetry beamed back to Sony HQ from the millions of consoles out there. All of which is fascinating perhaps, but is ultimately conjecture, and to really understand the extent to which the hardware changes impact the end user, well, what we need is proper forensic analysis of the revised machine stacked up against the launch model. And look, nobody does it better than Steve Burke and his team at Gamers Nexus, as you're about to discover.
Hey everyone, we're really excited to be contributing the hardware testing side of this video. It's been awesome working with Digital Foundry. They're really cool guys, very skilled at what they do. So it's a privilege to contribute a small piece of this video that they're putting together on the performance aspects of the PS5. So over at Gamers Nexus, we were working on disassembling a lot of PlayStations. We did testing with them as not disassembled as possible first, and then we moved towards combining them into sort of a stable test platform where we could do true like-for-like testing, because there are multiple different fans, and not only are there multiple different fans, but each fan, even if it's the same model, still has a 10% plus or minus range. That's normal for fans. It's how they're made in basically all industries, but plus or minus 10% on the RPM is enough to start moving the results. So we had to control for things like the fan. There are, of course, different coolers where we've got, this is sort of the current remains of what Richard sent over. Sorry, Richard. The device still works. It's still in good shape. And in fact, what we've done is at this point, since we've completed all the stock testing, we took the PCB from Digital Foundry's console and we transplanted the old cooler onto it. This is the newer cooler design. I can't tilt it too much because it's got liquid metal on there, but we transplanted the coolers. That allows us to do a like for like. So we have an as is out of box set of tests with all of these thermocouples wired up. We've really improved the thermocouple wiring and done more of them. And then we have a like for like where it's been modified so that we can get a more scientific look at it, but one that's not as out of box. So you get both sides of it. So to answer the questions that Richard sent over, we had a few of them. Our video will have the full depth on all of this. Please check it out if you don't mind. We're gonna have a lot of charts and we'll have follow-up videos as well because we did too much. I got obsessive with it. We did too much testing. But anyway, his questions were, he said the number one question he had was the extent to which the temperatures have changed across the SoC with the simplified cooler design and whether the RAM issue we identified previously with temperature has been resolved. There's a lot of caveats with some of these answers and we'll explain those in hours, but the SoC temperatures, they are a little bit different. They're not so different that we're necessarily worried about it one way or the other. It's tough to test the SoC temperature differences for reasons we'll explain elsewhere, but ultimately we're seeing a couple degrees maximally. We're not concerned about it, so that seems fine. The memory is still roughly the same place it was before. We are not seeing major reductions in memory temperature. We're not seeing major increases in memory temperature by and large. There may be some caveats there as we get through testing for the rest of it, but overall, no, it hasn't really been resolved. However, we would still classify the memory temperatures where they are right now, which is high 80s or so on most of the modules at worst, as a concern rather than necessarily a crisis. And so our recommendation to you all would be, if you have a PlayStation 5, the way to deal with this, don't mod it. It's likely that most people would break it if they try to mod it, but instead, make sure it's maintained. Don't let dust build up. It's really easy for you to pop those panels off. Anyone can do it. For the most part, you just smack it and it comes off, and keep the dust out of there, clean it every now and then. Don't put it in a crammed media cabinet or any kind of enclosed shell of furniture, because that's where the memory concern becomes a memory problem, because your local ambient temperature is going to increase as those factors get worse or more constrained, and that's where you start developing potential longevity concerns or otherwise. So make sure you maintain the device. Now the VRM thermals, from what we've measured, are actually better. And we think that's because the base plate has better contact to the memory and the neighboring components to the VRM. So that's benefiting the VRM as well, because it's getting heat out of the area more efficiently. At least that's what we think is the reason. The base plate in the new and the old one have that heat pipe in it as well. So if you're not familiar how that works, the heat pipe has an evaporator and a condenser. The condenser is where the liquid turns back from a gas into the drop of liquid that it is and flows back down the tube, capillary actions involved. So anyway, VRM thermals look better. Digital Foundry also asked us if we would go out of our way to pursue the new versus the old PlayStation 5, and they're not that different where we would actively pursue one or the other, given especially the supply constraints right now. It's still a kind of get whichever one you can and maintain it well. Now, Rich also asked, he said, not a problem in my opinion, but the unit did seem slightly louder than both of his launch units, and sort of asked what our thoughts were. So it is definitely possible that one unit to the next could be louder, and likely what's happening is less of a change with the heatsink and more of a change with the fans, where we get back to that 10% unit to unit variance, or the actual fan model difference. They spin at different RPMs. We'll have this chart in our video, but they're plus or minus 100 RPM from one unit to the next. That definitely creates that noise difference that Rich is talking about. Finally, a brief explainer why a smaller heatsink may or may not benefit the PlayStation 5. So in scenarios where it does potentially benefit the PS5 thermals, what you're looking at is a combination of a base plate change where there's a better contact patch with the memory in some locations now, still a concern, but better contact patch with the base plate changes. The heatsink proper potentially has less flow resistance now. This is something we could test if we needed to go further with it, but potentially less flow resistance. We think that there is better guided flow. There's more guidance to the air path, so it gets more efficiently out of the box, but it could come down to things like fin pitch, density, and direction or orientation. We'll talk about all of that in our video, so check it out if you want to learn more about the PlayStation 5 differences. We went a little bit overboard with it, but it'll be a lot of fun and maybe learn some things along the way. Thank you to Digital Foundry for hosting us here as well, and for the opportunity to test the unit that they bought. Back to you, Rich.
Thanks so much for that, Steve. And I mean, well, how do you top that? I really hope this gives our audience a taste of the kind of extreme depth that Gamers Nexus puts into its work. But look, if you want to learn more about the PS5 hardware, it goes without saying that you should check out their channel, and there's a link to their full hardware analysis below. So look, there are changes to the hardware. There are some variances in temperatures, but ultimately, seems to me that you're just as well off with a CFI-1100 machine as you are with a launch model. But what about game performance? Now, this should be a formality because the whole point of a console is that it's a fixed platform, right? Every machine out there should perform identically to the next one. Potentially muddying the waters somewhat, at least in terms of user perception, is Sony's implementation of a boost clock on both CPU and GPU. Typically on PC components, a boost clock increases frequencies to the maximum allowed by a number of factors, including temperatures and power. So I noted a lot of users are still not entirely clear on how this works on PlayStation 5. There's been commentary talking about the new PlayStation 5 potentially running slower than an old one, because a pared back cooling solution could potentially reduce performance because it's getting hotter. And yeah, you know what? That would apply to virtually any modern PC CPU or GPU, but the boost clock on PlayStation 5 works very, very differently. As Mark Cerny explained in The Road to PlayStation 5, clocks are determined by how workloads interact with what Sony calls a model SoC, a single example processor. The behavior of that single processor in terms of power management then maps to every retail unit, so every game should run at the same clocks on every PlayStation 5. This is one reason why the size of the PlayStation 5 is so large and the cooling solution is so robust. It has to handle temperatures no matter the quality of the silicon in your particular unit. Rather than reduce performance if the cooler can't handle the heat, we're more likely to see the unit shut down instead. Now, this hasn't happened to me, and it's not for want of trying, but here's the warning message that the PlayStation 5 comes up with. And to head off the inevitable what about Xbox question, well, it's the same thing. But it also occurs to me that the boost clock on PS5 hasn't been specifically tested in delivering the exact same performance from one machine to another, and to be honest, in the world of 30 FPS and 60 FPS caps, it's actually really difficult to test in like-for-like scenarios. So here's what I came up with in sort of formulating a benchmarking suite. First of all, I've already mentioned Miles Morales in Performance RT mode, It's mostly a clean 60, but you can find dips beneath. I've also talked about how Control's photo mode removes the 30 FPS cap in RT graphics mode. Next up, Resident Evil Village. It's a flawless 60 FPS with RT disabled, but you will encounter repeatable drops with ray tracing enabled. Godfall? By default it runs at 2400 by 1350 resolution, but there is a native 4K quality mode, again with an unlocked frame rate, and this intro sequence here is eminently repeatable. Oh yes, and in a similar vein to Resident Evil Village, here's Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition's prologue. This is running at native 4K with ray tracing enabled once again. So what we're looking for here are matched frame rate readings from one run to the next, but because we're seeing performance in context of what is being rendered, where variants do appear, we stand a pretty good chance of figuring out where dynamic features may be making a difference. So here, for example, in Godfall, I'm comparing multiple runs of the initial cinematic on PlayStation 5 digital running on retail firmware. The digital is identical to the disc model, bar the lack of optical drive, of course. All three runs are essentially identical until we get to this area with an explosion of particle effects. Likely owing to the dynamic nature of the particle effects here, performance is different across all three runs until we switch scene, where we return to parity. So yeah, we know now where the game performs identically from run to run and where it doesn't. Looking at Control, we have 5 scenes compared here across 3 runs, and aside from some averaging differences, likely owing to VSync, it's the same across the board. Moving on to Resident Evil Village though, some variances are noticeable, minor, but they are there. Again, likely down to dynamic elements in this scene, as the snow rendering ensures that the frames we're comparing from one run to the next are very slightly different. Armed with this knowledge, we can take our old PS5 launch unit data and stack it up against the new model. Despite the per run variances we saw with Resident Evil Village, the new PlayStation 5 is effectively identical to the old model. And similarly, looking at Godfall, the readings are very similar indeed, except for the part of the sequence heavy in particle effects. Spider-Man Miles Morales, again, it's very similar across the board. There are matching drops on scene changes, but this is Insomniac buffering a frame to ensure the TAA always works with no raw frames on camera cuts. Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition. Yeah, again, it's totally like for like across the board. The frame rate numbers may update at slightly different intervals, simply down to averaging, though we did try to synchronize all clips to the same beginning frame. Curiously, there are very slight timing differentials between runs of the same content, even on the same console. So I think at this point we have established that the new PlayStation 5 acts exactly like the old one, and where it does not, we can look at the content and explain the slight differences. So on the face of it, this may prove that the boost clock is acting exactly as it should on 2 completely separate PlayStation 5s. Although it isn't how the Model SoC implementation works for boost, I wanted to test that the new PS5 doesn't lose performance in a thermally constrained environment. So pity the CFI-1100 here, as it's shoehorned into my IKEA Besta media cabinet in what can only be described as a don't try this at home scenario. The shelves here barely contain the PlayStation 5, and you can see from the rear that there's not really much in the way of clear space behind the media cabinet either. And yeah, apologies for my lackluster cable management. You might see that at the back there are actually a couple of wooden panels further constraining airflow. And then I began the stress test using the Control photo mode technique to ensure a consistent 200 watt plus power draw. Now, I did leave the front door open on the cabinet because fundamentally I'm not a savage, but the bottom line is that I left it like this for 2 hours. Let's just say that when I got the machine out of the cabinet, the plastics were very warm to the touch, and the rear exhaust could be described actually as hot. But regardless, game performance did not seem to be affected at all. So these are benchmarks run with the PS5 in this stress test environment after 2 hours of max power draw. Let's look at Godfall first, hot versus cooler run on the same CFI-1100 unit. There's exactly the same behaviour, a completely identical run through the introductory sequence with the familiar variance we saw in the area of the run that's particularly particle heavy. Now that part entirely random of course on a run by run basis, but ironically the charbroiled console actually runs a touch faster in that dynamic area. We established that Resident Evil Village can turn in different results run to run, again likely down to aspects of the sequence being rendered ever so slightly differently. But again, no surprises here with the cool versus hot run. The game hits the same bottlenecks regardless of temperature. Performance-wise, the new PlayStation 5 does seem to run identically to my PlayStation 5 Digital running on retail firmware. Wrap-up time. I'm really hoping that Steve's excellent work in looking at the internals of the new PlayStation 5 has proven sufficiently illuminating and gives us final answers in terms of whether Sony's reduction in materials and, well, the size of the cooler actually has any material impact on the heat dissipation capabilities of the machine. All I can really say is the experience of owning it was basically identical. The concept of choice becomes somewhat moot as the 1000 series is likely end of line, and I'd expect the 1100 to be taking over as the only choice going into the crucial holiday season. But that's all from me for now. Like, subscribe, share, ring the bell for instant notifications if you are already subscribed. And yes, please do consider the DF supporter program for tons of early access. DF Direct ahead of everyone else, plus some phenomenal stuff being delivered on our retro tier. So, we've made it to the end of the video. So yeah, not much else to say except thanks for your patience as we put this one together. But the bottom line is that when Gamers Nexus can add so much to our understanding of the new machine, I thought the delay was worth it. And beyond that, well, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.